And thanks you at home for joining us this hour. All right, it started just after 10 this morning. It only just wrapped up this past hour. I told you last night this was going to be an all-day spectacle, but honestly, even I had no idea it was going to be this much of an all-day spectacle. So, all right, the man of the day, Peter Strzok. Peter Strzok, until recently, he was the head of the counterintelligence division at the FBI, which means he was literally the person in the U.S. government in charge of countering foreign countries' intelligence operations in the United States. Like, let's say, for example, if the Russians or someone mounted a massive active measures effort to swing our presidential election and buy themselves a pet U.S. president in the process, Peter Strzok would lead the counterintelligence division of the FBI in the effort within our government to find that out, to investigate it, and to stop it. Part of the fallout of the Russia investigation and the Republican backlash against that investigation is that Peter Strzok's career has been dismantled. And the president and Republicans who support the president have held Peter Strzok up for public scorn as a terrible person. That is one of the ways that Peter Strzok will go down in history when all this is said and done. America, big picture, right? America was hit by a massive Russian intelligence operation that infected our democracy, right? That was designed to sway an election the way Russia wanted it swayed and to hurt our country in the process. The political party that benefited from that attack responded to that attack in part by destroying and removing the top official in the U.S. government in charge of fighting Russian intelligence operations on our soil. So that's one of the ways Peter Strzok will go down in history. Another is the remarkable fact that while the FBI was mounting this major counterintelligence investigation into a presidential campaign, and the question of whether that campaign was in cahoots with a hostile foreign government in its intelligence operation that was designed to sway the election, while that was happening, that FBI investigation was never leaked to the public. Ever. That, too, will go down in history, right? The existence of the counterintelligence investigation into what Russia was doing and whether or not the Trump campaign was in on it, that investigation was only publicly confirmed by FBI Director James Comey in March 2017, 2 full months after Donald Trump had been sworn in as president. The FBI kept that information secret for the entire campaign and then refused to confirm it until months into the Trump presidency, despite media reports starting to get wind that maybe something there was going on, right? The FBI didn't tell anybody about it before the election. They didn't confirm it publicly until months after Trump was sworn in. They kept it completely mum because it was an ongoing investigation. Right? That is a remarkable thing about that investigation, on which Peter Strzok was the senior counterintelligence agent. It's also one of the very first points that Peter Strzok made today when it was his turn in front of the microphone.
In the summer of 2016, I was one of a handful of people who knew the details of Russian election interference and its possible connections with members of the Trump campaign. This information had the potential to derail and quite possibly defeat Mr. Trump, but the thought of expressing that or exposing that information never crossed my mind.
The Republican case against Peter Strzok, them defining him as enemy number one, right? The way they have made him subject to public pillory, right, is by claiming that his work on the Russia investigation was motivated purely by his partisan wish to hurt the presidential campaign of Donald Trump. If that's the case, then honestly, why didn't he or anybody else at the FBI tell the public at any point before the election that Donald Trump's campaign was in fact the subject of a very serious counterintelligence investigation? If the whole thing was motivated by bias to try to make sure Trump didn't get elected, then why didn't they tell the American public that Trump shouldn't be elected? Right? This is awkward, right? It's a sort of foundationally awkward thing. And that's how the day started, but then Peter Strzok went on to make the whole day quite awkward for Republicans today. I mean, Republicans have been salivating over the prospects for this hearing. The name Peter Strzok has filled Republicans with glee for months. They have gone after him, especially in the conservative media. They were super excited today to berate Peter Strzok over his personal texts that he sent during the campaign to an FBI lawyer he was involved with, a woman named Lisa Page. The problem is, it is a lot easier to beat up a guy who isn't sitting right there, fully alive, more than able to explain exactly what he meant.
Sir, if I may, what is important is that these texts represent personal beliefs just like those that you'd find on my personal phone. What these texts do not represent is any act, any suggestion of an act, any consideration that we need to do this or not do this. And furthermore, I would encourage you, as I believe I forget who I said this to earlier this morning, you need to read these texts in the context of what was going on at the time. So when I make the comment about Trump having no idea how destabilizing his presidency would be, that came on the heels of a speech where then candidate Trump said he didn't know whether or not the United States should honor its commitment to mutual defense under NATO.
I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much. That's not briefly. Mr. Chairman, in light of these actual...
No.
Give him that opportunity.
Everyone will suspend. I told the gentleman he could answer briefly. He has answered briefly. And
he has not finished answering.
We will now turn to the gentlewoman from Washington, D.C. for her questions.
Oh, you want to ask me about what I meant there when I said the Trump presidency might be destabilizing? That was about NATO. On the night before Trump officially accepted the Republican nomination, the day before, the then candidate had publicly questioned America's commitment to defending our allies in NATO in an interview with the New York Times. This is a real thing that happened, that Peter Strzok responded to as an American. Quoting from that New York Times article, quote, asked about Russia's threatening activities, which have unnerved the small Baltic states that are among the more recent entrants into NATO, Mr. Trump said that if Russia attacked them, he would decide whether to come to their aid only after reviewing if those nations have fulfilled their obligations to us. As the Times wrote, quote, Mr. Trump's statement appeared to be the first time a major candidate for president had suggested conditioning the United States defense of its major allies. Right, and it's very familiar, right? And that is the same dynamic we saw today, this very morning, where the president threatened that if fellow members of NATO didn't commit to raise defense spending, he would, quote, do his own thing. We will have more on that coming up. So not only was Peter Strzok responding to a real thing in the world where the idea of Trump having a destabilizing presidency might be a reasonable observation, right? It's also something that in this moment, in this day, in our lives, we're living through the manifestation of that now that he is president. That's why Darrell Issa really didn't want to talk about that. Okay, NATO, we're not going to talk about that. Let's move on. At another point in today's hearing, under hostile questioning from Oversight Committee Chairman Trey Gowdy, Peter Strzok did get to explain the context of an August 8th text message from 2016, one of the ones that Republicans really, really love quoting. In the exchange, Lisa Page had written to Peter Strzok, quote, Trump's not ever going to become president, right? To which Peter Strzok responded, no, he's not. We'll stop it. Well, today, given the chance to actually explain the context of that text and what he meant, Peter Strzok did so on TV, out loud, and it was not what Republicans wanted. Also, check out the response in the room when he finishes up here.
I think it's important when you look at those texts that you understand the context in which they were made and the things that were going on across America. In terms of the text that we will stop it, you need to understand that that was written late at night, off the cuff, and it was in response to a series of events that included then candidate Trump insulting the immigrant family of a fallen war hero. And my presumption, based on that horrible, disgusting behavior, that the American population would not elect somebody demonstrating that behavior to be president of the United States. It was in no way, unequivocally, any suggestion that me, the FBI, would take any action whatsoever to improperly impact the electoral process for any candidate. So I take great offense and I take great disagreement to your assertion of what that was or wasn't. As to the 100 million to 1, that was clearly a statement made in jest and using hyperbole. I, of course, recognize that millions of Americans were likely to vote for candidate Trump. I acknowledge that is absolutely their right. That is what makes our democracy such a vibrant process that it is. But to suggest somehow that we can parse down the words of shorthand textual conversations like there's some contract for a car is simply not consistent with my or most people's use of text messaging. I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, at no time in any of these texts did those personal beliefs ever enter into the realm of any action I took. Furthermore, this isn't just me sitting here telling you, you don't have to take my word for it. At every step, at every investigative decision, there are multiple layers of people above me, the assistant director, executive assistant director, deputy director, and director of the FBI, and multiple layers of people below me, section chiefs, supervisors, unit chiefs, case agents, and analysts, all of whom were involved in all of these decisions. They would not tolerate any improper behavior in me any more than I would tolerate it in them. That is who we are as the FBI. And the suggestion that I, in some dark chamber somewhere in the FBI, would somehow cast aside all of these procedures, all of these safeguards, and somehow be able to do this is astounding to me. It simply couldn't happen. And the proposition that that is going on, that it might occur anywhere in the FBI, deeply corrodes what the FBI is in American society, the effectiveness of their mission, and it is deeply destructive.
You can see from the reaction from the Democrats in the room there how that landed. This is not what Republicans were expecting or hoping for from their day to put Peter Strzok in the hot seat, right? They thought this would be beat the piñata day. Turns out the piñata is alive and it has its own bat. Here's Republican Congressman Trey Gowdy trying again, though, questioning Peter Strzok about a text. This one was from after President Trump was elected. And he's explaining that, Peter Strzok is explaining that his "we will stop him" tweet meant that he thought the American people would stop him because, for obvious reasons that he spelled out.
You wanted him to resign 2 months into his presidency?
Sir, my sense was, in a personal belief, that I was not pleased with the direction and things that were being done with the presidency.
I thought you trusted the American people. I thought that was what you said in August of 2016, that the American people would stop him, and then they didn't stop him. And here we are in March, all of a sudden not trusting the American people anymore.
Sir, what I utterly trust the American people. What I worry about is when the government of Russia puts their fingers on the scale and causes the will of the American people to be something other than America electing their president.
I utterly trust the American people, Congressman. What I worry about is when the government of Russia puts their fingers on the scale, causes the will of the American people to be something other than America electing our president. Right, Mr. Gowdy? You agree with that, Congressman, don't you? We're changing the subject? Okay. We also heard Peter Strzok explain in his own words today for the first time what information he was working with in those frantic last few days of the campaign, the start of the investigation, the nature of the information that had come into the FBI about Russia's actions, and where that information had come from.
During your June 2018 interview, I noticed some concern in your voice when recalling the 2016 campaign season, specifically October 2016, and specifically as it relates to the state of the Trump-Russia investigation. Why were you so concerned about what was happening at that time?
Well, I think trying to keep this at a level, not talking about open investigations.
Only
yes, ma'am. So the predicating information, the information we had, which was alleging a Russian offer of assistance to a member of the Trump campaign, was of extraordinary significance. It was credible. It was from an extraordinarily sensitive and credible source. And as we looked at what that represented, the key time was obviously coming into the election. And so for us, there was absolutely a need to, one, this was a serious allegation, two, of extraordinary gravity, and three, given the fact that the election was upon us and that if, in fact, then candidate Trump were elected, that whether he or certainly more likely or possibly members of his campaign were actively working with the Russians, we needed to get to the bottom of that. It could be that none of them were. It could be that some, or it could be on a far worse scale, but the urgency for us to understand what was going on in advance of the election and certainly in advance of any inauguration, I can't overstate the importance of that.
It was from an extraordinarily credible and sensitive source. The information we had The predicating information, the information we had, which was alleging a Russian offer of assistance to a member of the Trump campaign, that was of extraordinary significance. It was credible. It was from an extraordinarily credible and sensitive source. This was a serious allegation of extraordinary gravity. The urgency for us to understand what was going on in advance of the election and certainly in advance of the inauguration, I can't overstate the importance of that. We haven't heard that kind of detail before about the status of the Russia investigation and what the FBI had started investigating. We at least haven't heard that before from the senior counterintelligence chief who was leading it at the time. Another thing we learned came during some questioning by the top Democrat on the committee. Congressman Jerry Nadler tried to get Peter Strzok to explain why he had prioritized the Russia investigation over the Clinton email investigation in the last month of the 2016 campaign. That's, of course, one of the big criticisms Republicans have leveled at Peter Strzok, right, is the idea that he was somehow acting unfairly or in a biased way when he prioritized the Russia investigation over the Clinton email investigation in the final month of the campaign when new emails were discovered on the laptop of Anthony Weiner, the husband of Hillary Clinton's top aide, Huma Abedin. Peter Strzok's lawyer, we sort of knew that there was going to be something coming on this because Peter Strzok's lawyer had already taken a swing at this ahead of today's hearing. He had already put out a public statement ahead of the hearing today, essentially saying, yeah, of course he prioritized the Russia investigation. Anybody would. Quote, not every FBI investigation is of equal importance to U.S. national security. There's simply no equivalence between an investigation into the possible mishandling of classified information, a relatively commonplace occurrence in the FBI's Washington field office, and credible evidence suggesting that the presidential campaign of a major party candidate was actively colluding with a hostile foreign power in a way that could undermine the integrity of an American presidential election. Quote, to require senior national security officials to profess fealty to this false equivalence is both short-sighted and dangerous. So that had been Peter Strzok's line on this question through his lawyer before today's hearing. When he finally got to sit down in front of the microphone today at the committee hearing today, he was able to give his own account in his own words of why he did that, which included some completely new information that had never been revealed before.
The first reason I did it is because the director told me to. The director said it was our top priority, which was relayed from him and AD Priestep. And the second thing was, yes, clearly when you look at an allocation of resources based on the threat to national security, the Russia influence investigations were a much greater impact than a mishandling of classified information investigation.
Thank you. But the first reason was the director told you to.
Yes, sir.
Director told you to. That is something new that we learned today. Then FBI Director James Comey ordered Peter Strzok to prioritize the Russia investigation ahead of the Clinton email investigation at that point because of the far graver and more urgent threat it posed at that point. We did not necessarily expect to get that kind of information today, but hey, when you spend 10 hours questioning the country's senior counterintelligence official looking into Russian matters, you're going to learn some things you might not expect. Republicans have been waiting for this day. They've been so excited for their opportunity to dig their teeth into Peter Strzok and make him even more of an enemy. They knew and they hoped that it would result in all kinds of headlines. Except what we saw today from allies of the president didn't necessarily produce the kind of headlines they were after. It was sort of clear heading into this today that they might have bitten off more than they could chew with Peter Strzok. 10 hours in front of this committee today where they didn't lay a finger on him proves that more than true. The top Democrat from today's hearing joins us next.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.